In the winter of 1884, a woman named Bo Jennings turned a breech calf in a 3-day blizzard, alone except for a stubborn gray mule and a neighbor who had ridden 2 miles through horizontal snow to help her hold the lantern. The herd came through, every last head. And when Hadley Marsh rode over from the next property that spring, expecting to find what he had predicted he would find, he found instead 220 cattle on 480 acres of eastern Colorado grass, fat and turned out and grazing like the winter had been a mild one. He sat his horse at the fence line for a long time before he said anything. What he eventually said was not much, and that was about right. To understand how that morning came to pass, it helps to go back to the spring before it, to Harlan County in the Colorado Territory in the year 1883, when a man named Clem Jennings married a woman named Bo Aldcutt in a ceremony that took less than 20 minutes and was witnessed by a circuit preacher, a feed supplier named Del Greer, who happened to be settling accounts in town that day, and a small yellow dog that belonged to no one in particular. The arrangement had been Clem's idea from the beginning, which was clear enough in how he described it to anyone who would listen. He was 51 years old and carried a weight in his chest that the valley doctors had been watching for 2 years, and he had a property dispute with a neighboring title holder to the south that had been grinding through the territorial courts since 1879. His own deed was clean, but his cash position was not, and the simplest path through the legal tangle required consolidating adjacent holdings that technically belonged to the Aldcott family through a line of inheritance that had gotten tangled when Ruth Aldcott's late husband had subdivided the parcel before his death. The portion that mattered to Clem's title sat in Bo's name by default, because Bo was Ruth's daughter-in-law from a first marriage that had lasted 3 years before her husband, Ruth's son Thomas, had died of a fever outside of Lamar in the summer of 1880. Bo was 27 years old in the spring of 1883. She had been managing the smaller Aldcott portion, 40 acres of it grazing land and the rest in a kitchen garden and a modest hay lease. For going on 3 years without much help from anyone, Ruth, who lived 1 valley east, came by when the work required a second set of hands, and Bo went to Ruth's when Ruth needed the same. They had built something between them in those years that was not quite friendship and not quite family, and was really its own thing entirely, made out of traded labor and plain speech, and the particular understanding that comes from 2 women doing hard work in a hard place without complaint and without pretense. Clem had not married Bo for any of that. He had married her because her signature on a deed transfer was the most efficient resolution to a problem he was tired of carrying. He told people that plainly, including Bo herself, which was at least honest. He had not asked her to give up the 40 acres. He had asked her to sign a consolidation that brought them formally under one title, with the understanding that she would be provided for and would have a household and would want for nothing so long as the ranch was earning. Bo had heard this kind of language before in her first marriage, where it had meant something different in practice than it sounded in theory. She had signed the papers anyway, with her eyes open, because her options in Harlan County in 1883 were not numerous, and because Clem Jennings, for all his prairie practicality, had at least looked her in the face when he made the offer. The Jennings Ranch was 480 acres in the foothills east of the main range, carrying 220 head of mixed cattle and a small hay operation that Del Greer had been subsidizing through the winter with a feed account that stood at $340 by the time the wedding happened. The land was good land. The house was a solid log structure with 2 rooms and a proper plank floor, which Bo noticed immediately, having spent her first marriage on packed dirt. The barn was larger than the house, which was also correct in her estimation. She moved her things over in a wagon on a Thursday in April. She brought her books, which filled 2 crates, and her mother's iron skillet, and a pair of leather work gloves that had been re-soled 3 times and were still better than any she had found in a store. Clem watched the books come in with an expression she could not quite read. "You read a good deal," he said. "I do," she said. He did not say anything else about it, and she put them on the shelf she had already decided would be hers. They were not unkind to each other in those first weeks. They were 2 practical people, sharing a practical arrangement, and they navigated it with the careful politeness of people who have agreed on terms and mean to honor them. Clem knew the ranch and explained it to her without being asked, which she appreciated. He showed her the hay leases, the head count, the account ledger with Del Greer's balance written in the back column in red ink. He showed her where the fence line went soft on the north quarter and needed attention before fall. He showed her where the spring ran reliable and where it did not, and which cows were close to their time and which were not, and how to read the sky over the western range when it took on that particular gray-green color in the afternoon. She took it all in and said little, which he seemed to take as understanding, which it was. If she had imagined anything for herself in that arrangement, she kept it to herself. She was not a woman who spent much time on imagining. She was a woman who looked at what was in front of her, assessed it honestly, and got to work. That habit had kept her solvent through 3 years alone on 40 acres, and she saw no reason to abandon it now. In June, Clem received a letter from his attorney in Pueblo. There was a complication in the title dispute, something about a survey line that had been recorded incorrectly in 1877 and would require his physical presence to resolve. He was not unduly alarmed. He had dealt with the courts before. He packed a bag, saddled his better horse, and told Bo he would be back in 6 weeks. She stood in the doorway of the barn while he saddled up. She asked if there was anything specific he wanted done with the north fence while he was gone. He said whatever she thought was right. He rode out on a Monday morning in the middle of June, the mountains behind him still holding their snow at the peaks, the valley grass green and thick and already past the knee. 6 weeks came and went. Bo fixed the north fence. She did it with Pepper, the gray mule that Clem kept for heavy hauling and that most men in the county considered half useless because he would not be hurried and could not be spooked into speed. Bo had decided within a week of arriving that Pepper was the most sensible animal on the property, because most of the things people used horses for were better done slowly, and Pepper understood that. She dragged new posts from the timber edge at the north corner, set them herself in the rocky soil, and stretched wire 3 rails high along 200 yards of sagging line. It took 9 days. When it was done, she stood at the end of it and looked back at what she had built, and then she went inside and ate supper. The 8th week passed without a letter. Then the 10th. Ruth came over from the East Valley in the last week of July, arriving in the late morning with a wheel of hard cheese in the kind of silence that meant she already knew something and was deciding how to say it. They sat on the porch with cups of cold water and looked at the hay meadow together for a while. "No word," Ruth said. It was not a question. "No word," Bo confirmed. Ruth nodded once, the way she had of acknowledging a hard fact without dramatizing it. She had been widowed twice, first by Thomas's father from a bad winter in 1871, and then by Thomas himself from the Lamar fever, and she had developed over those years a kind of economical relationship with misfortune that Bo had always found steadying. Ruth did not advise Bo to panic or to grieve or to plan for the worst. She said, "The hay will need to come in before the end of August," and that was the most useful thing anyone said to Bo that summer. They cut the hay together in the first week of August. Bo and Ruth and a hired man named Dolan, who Ruth brought from her own place for 3 days, and who worked hard and said almost nothing. They stacked it in the South Meadow barn, enough to winter 200 head if the season ran short, and a little more than enough if it didn't. Bo paid Dolan from the household cash and noted the amount in the back of the ledger, below Del Greer's balance in red. Clem's promised 6 weeks had become 12 by the time September arrived, and September brought the first cold nights and the particular smell of the eastern Colorado air that said the summer was done meaning it. Bo settled into the management of the ranch with the same deliberate attention she had given to the 40 acres, except that there was more of everything. More fence to ride, more cattle to track, more decisions to make about which animals to move and when, and which fields to rest through fall. She kept the ledger current. She tracked the head count. She noted when a cow looked off and watched it for a day before deciding. She was not learning to ranch. She had been ranching for 3 years, on smaller land with less at stake, and the skills transferred the way any real skills transfer, which is to say they transferred completely. What she did not have was anyone in the county who believed that was the case. Hadley Marsh had a property east and north of the Jennings land, 560 acres, and a reputation for knowing the county's business before the county knew it itself. He was not a cruel man. He was a practical man who had formed a practical opinion, which was that a woman of 27 could not winter 220 head on 480 acres without a man to manage the serious decisions, and that the kindest thing anyone could do for her was to say so clearly before the snow came, rather than after. He said this to Bo directly on a Thursday afternoon in October, sitting his horse at her gate in the polite way men had of delivering unwelcome assessments from an elevated position. He told her that there were 2 buyers who had already expressed interest in the property, that either of them would give her a fair price, and that waiting through a hard winter alone was a risk she did not need to take when the alternative was a clean sale and a settled life, somewhere more manageable. Bo listened to all of this from where she was standing, which was beside the gatepost with a fencing mallet in her right hand, having been in the middle of resetting a corner pin when he rode up. She let him finish. Then she thanked him for coming and said she would think on it. He rode off looking like a man who had done his duty and expected it to take. She went back to the corner pin. If she was shaken by that conversation, she did not show it. And she did not show it because she had decided something by then that was not dramatic and did not require announcement. She had looked at the hay in the South Meadow barn, and at the head count in the ledger, and at the fence lines she had ridden, and the spring she had cleaned out, and the calving records she had pulled from the summer, and she had added it all up in the way she added things up, which was, honestly, and the total had said she could hold this land through winter. Not easily, not without cost. But she could do it, and she knew she could do it. And Hadley Marsh's opinion of what she could or could not manage was interesting, but not relevant to the calculation. Ruth came by in October again, and in early November, and each time they spent the day working and the evening at the table with the lamp between them talking through what was coming. Ruth had wintered cattle herself before she had reduced her own herd after Thomas's father died, and she knew which problems announced themselves and which ones arrived without notice. She told Bo about the signs a cow showed in the week before a difficult calving, and what to watch for in a heifer that had not delivered before. She told her which of the south pasture shelters held heat, and which one leaked at the east corner and needed packing before December. She did not say any of this as advice. She said it as information shared between 2 people who were going to need it. The winter came in earnest by the last week of November, which was early even for Harlan County, and it was cold in the specific way of eastern Colorado cold that pushed through canvas and wood and had no patience for anything less than the best preparation. Bo worked from before dawn until after dark, every day, checking the shelters, moving cattle when a pasture froze too solid to graze, hauling hay from the south barn on Pepper's back because the wagon was too wide for the drifted track when the snow came heavy. She lost 2 head in December, one to a lung ailment that had been coming since fall, and one to a wire cut that she had treated too late. And she noted both in the ledger and felt them both with the particular weight of things that had been in her care and had not survived it. The county watched and waited. Del Greer asked her at the feed store in December whether she wanted to extend the account. She said she would manage from the cash she had and would settle the full balance in spring. He looked at her the way people in Harlan County had been looking at her for months, which was the look of someone who had already decided the outcome and was waiting for the evidence to arrive. She bought what she needed and took it home on Pepper's back. If you have ever seen a February blizzard come off the mountains in eastern Colorado, you know that they do not announce themselves the way summer storms do. They arrive behind a thin sky that turns the color of old pewter by mid-afternoon, and then by evening the wind has taken everything. The storm that came in the first week of February 1884 was 3 days of that kind of weather, hard and cold and consistent, the temperature dropping to somewhere between 25 and 30 below by the second night, the snow horizontal enough that you could not see the barn from the house door, and had to follow the guide rope that Bo had strung between them on the first morning when the sky told her what was coming. She had been in the barn almost continuously for the second day when the heifer in the south stall made it clear that things were not going the way they should. Bo had pulled calves before, 2 of them on the 40 acres, one in daylight and one at night, and she knew what a normal presentation looked like and what this was not. The calf was coming wrong, one front leg folded back, and the heifer was too tired and too cold and too young to manage it alone. She sent Pepper out through the blizzard to Ruth's. This requires explaining. Pepper was not a horse that could be given instructions and sent on errands. What Bo did was tie a piece of yellow oilcloth she knew Ruth would recognize to his halter and open the east pasture gate in the direction of Ruth's valley and let him go, because Pepper had made that walk to Ruth's with Bo enough times that she believed he would make it without her. She was not certain of this. She had no other option. Pepper came back with Ruth on his back 2 hours later. Ruth was wearing everything she owned, her coat over 2 wool shirts and a pair of her late husband's canvas trousers, and she was carrying a lantern that had somehow stayed lit through 2 miles of blowing snow. She did not say anything when she came through the barn door. She handed Bo the lantern, pulled off her outer coat and rolled her sleeves and looked at the heifer. "How long has she been at it?" Ruth said. 3 hours on the wrong presentation, Bo said. Ruth nodded and they went to work. What followed was the kind of labor that does not have any drama in the usual sense, because it is too precise for drama and requires too much attention. Bo held the lantern and the heifer's head while Ruth worked, and then Ruth held the heifer, and Bo worked, and then they switched back, and the barn was cold enough that their breath came in clouds, and the hay on the floor had a rime of frost on it by the time they were an hour in. The wind hit the barn walls in long, sustained pushes that made the structure creak and settle, and the other cattle in the near stalls shifted and blew and gradually went quiet. And outside there was nothing but the sound of the blizzard pressing in from the mountains. The calf came through just past midnight, a heifer calf, small but breathing, up on her feet within the half hour, the way cattle come into the world when they have fought their way in. Bo rubbed her dry with a rough grain sack while the mother licked her face, and Ruth stood at the stall rail with her arms crossed and her sleeves still rolled to the elbow, and watched them both. Ruth said, "She'll do." Bo said, "She'll do." They slept in the barn that night, both of them wrapped in the horse blankets from Pepper's stall, with the lantern turned down low and the new calf tucked against her mother's side in the straw. Pepper stood at the far end of the barn in a state of profound self-satisfaction. He had, in his own assessment, handled the situation correctly, and nothing that happened after that changed his view of it. The blizzard broke on the morning of the third day. Bo walked the entire property on foot when the wind dropped, checking every shelter and every animal, Ruth a step behind her keeping count. They had lost one old bull to the cold in the north pasture, which Bo had half expected from the condition he had come into fall wearing. The rest of the herd was intact. 218 head on 480 acres, plus one new heifer calf that had come into the world sideways in a 3-day storm and intended to stay. Bo noted the numbers in the ledger that evening, seated at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and Ruth across from her drinking the last of the good tea. It was that evening, after Ruth had gone home and the lamp was burning low, that Bo let herself sit with what the last 8 months had been. Not with grief exactly, and not with anger, which she had set down sometime in the fall when she realized it was heavy and useless. With something quieter than either of those things. She had come to this ranch as a piece of a transaction, and she had stayed in it when the transaction's other party had departed, and she had learned every acre of it and wintered 220 cattle on it, and pulled a calf in a blizzard, and she had done it because it needed doing, and because it turned out she was the person there to do it. That was a fact. It did not need dressing up. In the spring, the letter came from Santa Fe. Clem had been detained in New Mexico territory, the original land dispute having grown into something more complicated that he did not fully explain, and he had married a second time, which explained the rest of it. The letter was not cruel. He was offering her a choice. He would return and resume management of the ranch, or he would sign the deed over to her name entirely, and they would settle the marriage in whatever way the territorial courts allowed. He said he understood if she was angry. He said he hoped she was well. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went out to finish the morning chores. She thought about the question while she worked. She thought about it the way she thought about most things, practically and without self-pity, turning it over the way you turn a fence post to check which end is sound before you set it. By the time she had finished the chores, she had her answer. She wrote back that evening. She thanked him for the letter. She asked him to sign the deed. It was 3 paragraphs, written in the clear, plain hand she had learned from her mother, and it said everything that needed saying and nothing that did not. The deed arrived in June, duly signed and witnessed before a notary in Santa Fe. Bo took it to the county seat and had it recorded in her name. The woman at the recording office, who knew Harlan County's opinion of the situation, glanced at the paper and then at Bo, and then back at the paper, and stamped it without comment. Bo walked out into the early summer heat and squinted at the mountains and thought about the north fence line. She stopped at Del Greer's feed store on the way home and settled the outstanding account. $340 paid from the household cash she had been accumulating carefully since the previous fall. Del counted it twice and wrote the receipt, and looked up at her with the expression of a man revising something. "Heard you came through the February storm all right," he said. "We did," she said. She took the receipt and folded it into her pocket alongside the copy of the deed. She had Pepper tied at the post outside, and she untied him and mounted and rode home through the early summer, the road dust rising behind her in small, quiet clouds, the meadow grass on either side of the track already past its best green, and running toward the gold that meant the hay would cut clean in August. Hadley Marsh rode over from the east property on a morning in late May, a few weeks before the deed arrived, but after the county had heard enough from Del Greer's account of the herd numbers to know what the winter had produced. He came to the gate, and Bo came out to meet him, and they stood for a moment in the ordinary morning light. The mountains to the west still white at the peaks, the valley below them settling into its spring green. He looked at the cattle in the south pasture. He looked at the barn and the fence lines and the new calf, nearly 4 months old by then, grazing beside her mother as though she had always been there, because she had. He said, "That's a good herd." "It is," Bo said. He said, "You want to take on the Greer lease in the north section this year?" "The family is moving to Pueblo, and I said I'd ask around." She said she would think about it, and she did think about it, and she took the lease. Hadley Marsh never said anything more about selling, not that year, and not in any of the years that followed, and Bo did not mention that he had once suggested it. That was simply not the kind of woman she was. Here is what the community that had watched and waited and predicted eventually had to contend with. Bo Jennings ran the Jennings Ranch for 37 years. She expanded it by 120 acres in 1891, taking in the Greer lease formally when the family sold the underlying title, and drove the head count to 340 by 1903. She hired 2 hands by the time the cattle operation required them. A taciturn older man named Fitch, who had worked cattle in the Panhandle, and a younger one whose name in the ledger is recorded as Orrin Doyle, and who stayed 20 years before he bought his own land, 1 county south. She sent her niece, Ruth's granddaughter, to the territorial school at Pueblo on money she had saved over 2 winters, and the girl came back and taught the Harlan County Schoolhouse for 15 years. Ruth Aldcott was at the ranch for the first haying of every summer until she was 72 years old, and her knees made the wagon seat too much to manage. After that, Bo rode east to Ruth's Valley once a week from May through September, and they sat on Ruth's porch in the evening and talked through whatever the land was doing and drank cold water out of the same crockery cups they had been using since 1883. Ruth died in the spring of 1909, and Bo planted a stand of wild plum on the slope above Ruth's homestead that spring and came back to tend it until the trees needed no more tending. Pepper died in the hard winter of 1891 at an age no one could quite calculate, because Clem had acquired him from a Mexican freighter in 1878, and the freighter had been vague about the animal's history. Bo buried him in the east pasture and smoothed the ground over with the back of a shovel and stood there for a long minute with her hands on the handle before she went back to work. She had other mules after that, good animals, all of them, but she did not name any of them what she had named him. There is a photograph that exists from around 1910, taken by a circuit photographer who came through Harlan County that year and set up in front of the county courthouse. Bo is standing slightly to the left of the frame, which is where she always stood in any grouping of people. Her coat brushed clean and her hat pulled level, her hands at her sides. The hands are the thing you notice. They are the hands of someone who has spent 27 years doing everything the land required of them, and they look exactly like that. And she does not look like a woman who is apologizing for it. She retired from active ranch management in 1921 at the age of 65 and moved into the 2-room house on the property while Orrin's son and a new hired man took over the daily work. She kept the ledger until the end of that decade, which meant she was still checking the head count and the fence reports and the hay weights at 73, and anyone who thought she had retired in any real sense had not been paying attention. She was buried in 1929 on the slope above the house where she had asked to be put, looking out over the 480 acres and the valley below them and the mountains to the west that still held their snow at the peaks until late in July. The marker was plain stone. Her niece, the schoolteacher from Pueblo, chose the words which were her name and the years she had lived and 4 words below that. She held it here. If you know a story about a woman the county predicted wrong, leave it in the comments below. There are more of those stories than anyone ever thought to write down. And if this one sat with you, there is another like it waiting just above this one, about a different piece of frontier land and a different pair of guarded people finding their way through it, which is worth your time if this one was. The morning Hadley Marsh rode to that fence line in the spring of 1884 and said almost nothing. There was a gray mule standing in the east pasture, watching him with the detached authority of an animal that had already assessed the situation and found it satisfactory. Pepper turned away first, dropping his heavy head to the new grass, and went back to the only thing that had ever interested him, which was the work that was actually in front of him, on the good ground, in the good morning.